Hi everyone, welcome to Rich Review. So for this video, we are going to learn about the differences among the three most common confusing concepts in assessment. The assessment of learning, assessment as learning, and assessment for learning. Okay, so we will try to understand the differences among these three. Okay, so these three are usually used interchangeably. And syempre, diri good naton hiyagin mamind, di ba? Kasi iniisip natin nga paprehas man la iton hira. But as an education graduate or as an education student, it is very important nga maaram kita or master kita hini nga mga concepts or at the very least maaram kita kung paano gamiton ini nga mga concepts. So again, in this video, we will be learning about hini nga tutulo nga concepts and of learning as learning and for learning in a simplified way using clues and some tips on how to easily remember hini nga mga tulo. Okay, so if you are interested to learn, please keep watching. First, let us have the three main purposes of assessment. An assessment po kasi may adaya tulo nga common nga mga purposes. An siya po inian, assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. Now, let us try to have the definition ini nga tutulo. Okay, so when we say assessment for learning, it enables teachers to use information about students' knowledge, understanding, and skills to inform their teaching. Next, an assessment of learning naman, it assesses teachers to use evidence of student learning to assess student achievement against learning goals and standards. While an assessment as learning, students use self-assessment and teachers' feedback to reflect on their learning, consolidate their understanding, and work towards learning goals. So, an siya po ini ang mga definition, hini nga mga assessments. So, kung asya po ini natin babasihan na medyo makuri, medyo mahalaba pag memorya. Okay, so in the next slides, we will try to learn or understand inihira tag-usa-usa. Okay? So first, we have the assessment for learning. So kapag sumira kita nga for, hatagalog is para. Okay? So technically, an assessment for learning is assessment para sa pagkatuto in Tagalog. Diba? So usually, nagamit kita ang word nga para or for alongside with purpose, goal, or objective. So, bagan masaring kita nga para ano, para diin, or for what. Okay, so example, nag-aaram ako yan na para may answer ako ha quiz or exam. So, in assessment for learning, it means this is a type of assessment nga ang iya purpose is to ensure learning. Okay? Inihimo ini nga assessment for learning para mahibaruan ang mga students. So, an assessment for learning is also termed as formative assessment. When we say formative assessment, amo inihian mga practices, mga methods, or anything nga ginihimohan teacher for the purpose of increasing the students' learning. And formative assessments are usually recorded but not graded. Why? Kasi ginihimo la inihiya han teacher ni an formative assessment para punan or para ma-fill ang learning gaps han students before the teacher can proceed to the next lesson. An assessment for learning occurs during instruction. So, kung mapapansin niyo, kung mapapansin natin, ang teachers kapag nag-discuss, may mga times nga magtatawag hiya han mga students ngan papakianhan regarding han lesson nga iya gindi-discuss. So that is a form of a formative assessment. May mga ginihimo ang teacher during instruction nga mga ways so that tanan nga students is maka-catch up or makahabol before pa man matapos ang discussion. Assessment for learning is an ongoing process. Ongoing process siya in a sense nga it is done in a frequent basis, and these are mga mini assessments or mga little bits of assessments nga ginihimo during discussion. Usually utod-utod ini nga mga assessments but in a continuous manner, hence ongoing process. And of course, an assessment for learning is done by the teacher. Ang teacher po ang nag-a-assess ang students learning, and at the same time, in-a-assess liwat ang teacher ang effectivity ang iya method or ang iya strategy of teaching. So, examples, quizzes, discussions, and question and answer. Asya po yung mga example ang formative assessment or an assessment for learning. Alright, so para mas matigamnan pa natin ang assessment for learning, here is the number 1 tip. Okay? For you, ongoing ang pagforma ni teacher during instruction. Okay, so para mas madali natin matigamnan ang assessment for learning, we say, for you, ongoing ang pagforma ni teacher during instruction. Inihiya nga for is tigaman hiya nga assessment for learning. Ngan ongoing, to note nga an for learning or an assessment for learning is an ongoing process. Ngan pagforma for the formative assessment ni teacher during instruction. Right? So, asya po ini mas madali nga memoryahon na para matigamnan natin ang assessment for learning. We say, for you, ongoing ang pagforma ni teacher during instruction. Right? Next, we have the assessment of learning. In Tagalog, an of is ng. So, technically, assessment ng pagkatuto or assessment ng natutunan. Okay, so ano ang nahibaruan or tubtubdiin ang nabaruan han mga students? So if you will notice, aada na hiya ha, past tense, di ba? Nangyari na hiya. Kay kasi, an assessment of learning is ginihimo hiya at the end of the term, discussion, or quarter. Meaning, tapos na po ang discussion. Tapos na po ang discussion, hini, dinhi. Okay, so the main difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning is the time period when they are used, kung saan hiragin gagamit. Kung an assessment for learning is formative assessment, an assessment of learning naman is summative assessment. So when we say a summative assessment, it refers to the whole. Ang ginpagtimpo-timpo na nga mga learnings han student. Okay, gin-measure din ni ang summary of learning. Ang summary, ang kabubusan na nga nahibaruan ng mga students. So tanan nga nahi-discuss ang teacher, gin-i-evaluate kung up to what extent or gaano ba kahirayo ang nahibaruan han mga learners. Example, a math subject for the topic operations with numbers. So for lesson 1, we have addition, lesson 2, subtraction, lesson 3, we have the multiplication, and lesson 4 is the division. So maghahatag ang teacher an assessment of learning by giving a unit test siguro so part 1 an addition, part 2 an subtraction, and so on and so forth, as long as mapapagbugos-bugos ang mga lesson nga gindiscuss ang teacher for the whole quarter or for the whole unit. Okay? So, an assessment of learning naman, it uses evidences of learning against goals and standards. Right? Ang teacher is nagagamit yan mga evidences of learning. Kailangan may pruwiba. Kailangan may makikita nga talaga may dan nahibaruan ang mga students. Okay? And teacher kasi can only say na the students have learned something kung naabot liwat ini nga mga students ang mga ginset nga mga objectives or ang mga goals and standards for that specific lesson or subject. That is why it is also important nga kung maghahatag ang test, kailangan good nga align ang objectives or ang mga goals ha type of assessment nga igahatag ni teacher. Okay, so same with assessment for learning. Ini po yung assessment is ginre-record liwat. However, this time graded na hiya. Okay, graded na po ini nga assessment. And it will be the basis for the teacher ha pag-decide kung pasarbaan student or kung pasarbaan ini nga mga learners ini nga quarter or ini nga subject. Examples, final exam, LET, state level or national level exams, unit test, and or summative test. Pwede liwat po iniya. Pasok po liwat inihira ha, assessment of learning. Okay, another tip para mas matigamnan natin ang assessment of learning, we have this one. Of course, at the end, nakuha ko na ang summary of goals ni teacher. Again, of course, at the end, nakuha ko na ang summary of goals ni teacher. And of po dinhi istigaman nga kanan assessment of learning inihiya. And at the end, meaning hakatapusan, di ba? Ginihimo ang assessment of learning kapag tapos na ang discussion or ang usa ka unit. O ngan summary of goals. Kaya of course, ang gingagamitan na po kasi niya or gingagamit ng mga objectives, ang mga goals, ang mga standards, han lesson hapag measure and learning. Ngan, this is also done by the teacher. Ang teacher po ang nag-a-assess han learning han mga students. So again, for assessment of learning, ang aton po din hitigaman is that, of course, at the end, nakuha ko na ang summary of goals ni teacher. Next, we have assessment as learning. In Tagalog, an as is bilang. Okay, so assessment bilang pagkatuto. So this time, an assessment naman po is being equated with learning. Nag-a-assess kay nag-aaram. Gin-a-assess kay karuyag mahibaro. Kumbaga, while you are doing assessment, you are also learning at the same time. Bilang. Alright? Bilang is like you are giving the assessment an equal identity with learning. Same na hira, an assessment is equal with learning. Assessment is equal ha pagkatuto. Ha assessment as learning naman, we have the self-assessment. Okay, so from the name itself, self, we can immediately understand na this type of assessment is done by the self. You, yourself, you as a learner, ikaw mismo ang nag-a-assess han imo self. Of course, it is the student. Okay, again, ang student po ang nag-a-assess han iya sarili nga pagkatuto. Okay, so the student wonders kung hain na ba ang iyan intindihan. Ano na ba ang iya maaram? That is why he tries to practice. He has some exercise to measure his own learning and tries to collect feedback or comments from the teacher para ma-improve ang iya learning. Okay, an assessment as learning is done during or after instruction. Unlike ang first two nga mga assessment nga itong discuss kanina, an assessment as learning is pwede mo during or after instruction. Di rin na kailangan maghulat na matapos ang discussion before mag-evaluate, before mag-assess hand learning. Okay, so for this type of learning, an student is ginmamonitor niya ang iya progress and collect feedback for improvement. Okay, so for this type of learning, ang mga students are not passive learners. Di rin nahiraan students nga ini-spoon feed ang mga teachers, but rather, he tries to monitor his progress. Ano na ba ang akong maaram? Ano pa ba ang kailangan ko mahibaruan? Or, hay na ba ako banda? Then, as he monitors his progress, he uses the feedback. Okay, he uses the feedback from teacher or trusted people para mas mag-improve pa hiya. Meaning, giving feedbacks to students is also recommended. Though we are saying an assessment as learning promotes independent learning, importante lagi hapon na we, as teachers, provide the students with enriching and valuable feedbacks so that ma-develop palalo ang ira competence. We also have peer assessment. Ha peer assessment naman, diri lahi student ang nag-a-assess ang iya learning. Kasi di ba limited man gudla ang perspective han kada usa aton. So in this type of assessment, you may ask your friend, your classmate, or a schoolmate to help you in assessing your learning. You and your classmate will help each other for you to learn. Okay, so kaupod ka ha process. As, di ba? As. Okay, pwede tayo liwat mat saring as, assessment as learning, kaupod ka ha process. Hence, assessment as learning. Okay, in this type of assessment also, pwede liwat maghatag ang teacher han specific criteria or mga rubrics nga pwede gamiton as basis kapag assess ang mga students sa era, classmate, or an era mismo sarili. Okay, so for us to remember liwat ini nga assessment as learning, we also have this one. As myself and as a friend, I will improve during and after this. Okay, so as myself, ikaw, as a friend to your classmate or your friend, I will improve during and after this. Okay, an assessment as learning is ikaw mismo, imo sarili or as or bilang kaibigan or bilang classmate, mag-i-improve ang imo learning during and after hand learning or during or after hand discussion. Okay. So again, let's have a short recap ang aton mga gin-discuss. So there are three main purposes of assessment. We have the assessment for learning. Okay, pagsumarin po kita ang assessment for learning, formative, ginihimo ya during instruction, and it is the teacher who assess the learning. Next is assessment of learning naman. We have the summative assessment. Ginihimo ya after instruction, ngan ang teacher liwat ang nagkapandak ang assessment. Then we have assessment as learning, the self-assessment or the peer assessment. Inihimo ya during or after instruction ngan by the student or pwede liwat ang teacher. Okay, that is the three main purposes of assessment. Alright, so let's have an exercise on assessment 4 of as learning. We have number 1. The question is, what is the primary purpose of assessment for learning? A. Teachers evaluate students' performance based on a specific criteria. Letter B. Students actively participate in their own learning process. Letter C. Teachers use this to monitor students' progress and inform their teaching. Letter D, the assessment takes place at the end of a learning period. So which is the correct answer? So the correct answer for question number 1 is letter C. Teachers use this to monitor students' progress and inform their teaching. Asya po ito an assessment for learning. Letter A, dere po ya pwede. Dere po ya for learning kay kasi based on a specific criteria. May na po ginagamit ng mga criteria hapag assess and learning. So this is have learning. Letter B naman is ang iya keyword is own, sarili. Of course, assessment as learning. And letter D naman, the assessment takes place at the end of a learning period. So at the end, this is summative of learning. Okay? So the correct answer for question number 1 is letter C. Next, question number 2. This type of assessment includes tests, examinations, portfolios, and etc. to measure learning. So which type of assessment is this? Number 1, assessment for learning. Letter B, assessment of learning. Letter C, assessment as learning. Letter D, A and B. Alright, so the answer for question number 2 is letter B, assessment of learning. Okay, when we say assessment of learning, nagamit na hiya mga evidences of learning. An example is portfolio, mga exam. Diba? Asya po ito ang mga example han, assessment of learning. Okay, and for us, dire po hira applicable a question number 2. Next, number 3. Development of self-assessment and peer assessment skills fall into which category? A, assessment for learning. B, assessment of learning. C, assessment as learning. Or letter D, both B and C. So which do you think is the correct answer? Alright, so the correct answer for question number 3 is letter C. Ang keyword po natin na question is self-assessment and peer assessment skills. So, na-discuss po natin kanina nga examples of assessment as learning is inihira nga duwa. An assessment for learning is formative assessment. An assessment of learning naman is summative assessment. Okay, next, number 4. Teacher Lara wants to measure students' learning by asking questions during instruction. So she is using this kind of assessment. A, assessment for learning. B, assessment of learning. C, assessment as learning. And letter D, A and C. So which is the kind of assessment that teacher Lara used or will use? Okay, so the question number 4 is an assessment na ginagamit ni teacher Lara is letter A, assessment for learning. And aton po keyword question is during instruction. At siya po ito natin tigaman pag sumaring kita nga for learning is during instruction. An assessment of learning, dire po pwede ang letter B, kay at the end of discussion. An assessment as learning naman, during and after. Okay, so mas pasok ang letter A. Okay, kasi during instruction la ang ginbanggit ha aton question. Now, let's have the last question, number 5. Which of the following statement is correct? Letter A, Assessment of learning is done by students by using rubrics and feedbacks from teacher. Letter B, any form of assessment is done by teachers only. Students cannot measure their own learning. Letter C, assessment as learning can be done only if the teacher is done with the lesson. And letter D, assessment as learning occurs during or after the instruction. Okay, so try to evaluate the four statements nga kitaon po natin kung haing dinhian correct na statement. Alright, so let us try to evaluate each statements. Letter A, assessment of learning is done by students by using rubrics and feedbacks from teacher. Is this correct? No. Assessment of learning is diri puhi ang mga students ang naghihimo. But rather, ini po nga definition is mas applicable hiya assessment as learning. Okay, assessment as learning yakay ang mga students mismo ang naggagamit or ang nag-a-assess ang learning. Okay, so assessment of learning, letter A is wrong. Letter B naman, any form of assessment is done by teachers only. Students cannot measure their own learning. Okay, obviously, an option B is wrong. Okay, di rin man po tanan nga assessment is ang teacher laan nag-ihimo, di ba? We also have the assessment as learning where the students can assess their own learning. So, diri po liwat letter B ang ating answer. Letter C naman, assessment as learning can be done only if the teacher is done with the lesson. So, ang aton po dinigin define is assessment as learning. Yan ang iya definition is kapag daw ang teacher is tapos na ang lesson. So, obviously, mali po liwat ang letter C. Okay, kay ang assessment as learning is pwede po liwat himuon bisan diri pa tapos ang teacher or during an instruction. Okay, so we now have letter D as our correct answer. Okay, again, assessment as learning is pwede po himuon during or after the instruction. Okay, so ang letter D la po ang tama nga statement. So that is why ang letter D po ang ating correct answer for question number 5. Alright, so what's your score? Please comment it in the comment section. Thank you for watching our video on assessment 4 of and as learning. So please like, share, and subscribe which review. Thank you for watching and God bless.